Chapter 5 of the CCUS Handbook, Roadmap for Developing Legal and Regulatory Frameworks. We are joined today with a guest speaker, Ingvild Ombudsved, who's the owner and founder of IOM Law, which is a law firm specializing in CCUS based in Norway. Ingvild's been working on CCUS for over a decade and also is one of the authors for the handbook. I will encourage you all to take a look at the text of Chapter 5 for more details. And with that, I will turn it over to Ingvild.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you so much for involving me in the handbook writing. It was such a fun experience, and I learned a lot from the colleagues and from you and all the team that was there. So thank you so much. So yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about what we did for the chapter 5 on the roadmap for developing legal and regulatory frameworks for CCUS. So first and foremost, we were sponsored by the U.S. Department of State Energy Resources. So thank you so much for that. So the whole chapter on the roadmap for making a regulatory framework for CCS is not a one-stop shop. This is how you have to do it. We have drawn up one alternative to how you can approach the drafting of regulatory frameworks, particularly focusing on countries with no current frameworks for CCUS in any shape or form already. So basically, we are drawing up a 6-step process in this chapter, where I'm going to go through each of those steps in more detail later. And also there are 2 of these steps that you can find separate chapters on. For example, there is a chapter on resources that we'll get back to later, talking about what kind of resources you as a regulator or policymaker can look at for inspiration when you are drafting your legal framework for CCS. And there is also a separate chapter on the drafting process itself. So now we're kind of just going to through the motions up to the drafting process starts, basically. We will also look at how in this chapter a little bit, how you can approach CCUS without having a specific framework in place already. So we have a couple of examples drawn up from Japan and Norway, and these will also be handled in more detail in that chapter on drafting or frameworks. So stay tuned for that. So this is just a very simplistic way of kind of demonstrating those 6 steps in the roadmap that I just mentioned. And even though there is a separation between these 6 steps in this model or in this figure, I want to emphasize that there isn't really a clear-cut boundary between each and every step, because they will interact with each other a little bit. You might go back and forth a little bit, and some steps you might have to repeat when you're meeting an uncertainty or a gap in your framework during the drafting process or as technologies develops and so forth. So I just want to make sure that I highlight that first and foremost. So this might seem very benign or simplistic, but before you start a drafting process, you really need to have that policy in place saying, why are you going to do CCS in the first place? A lot of countries come into the space of CCUS from a different perspective. Some countries come into it from a perspective of supporting energy security, for example, and to be able to continue energy production under Paris Agreement obligations. So you have to reduce emissions, but want to continue do the energy production and use as you have today. Others are maybe facing policy measures from EU or others imposing tariffs on imports, making it crucial to implement CCUS to reduce emissions in emissions intensive industries like steel and cement and so forth. So kind of identifying that strategy or that policy, why are you doing CCS in the first place, will be a driver throughout the process of drafting, because that might, for example, help you identify what agencies or ministries are supposed to be responsible for following up the permitting process, what type of natural resources that you need to take into consideration, what kind of infrastructure do you already have in place, and so forth. All of these things are kind of part of that country-specific policy or strategy process before you start drafting. And this will also be where you identify what type of resources you already have in terms of policy frameworks, permitting strategies, and agencies available to help you implement the framework, and also the industry when you come to that. Then after you identified the strategy and policy, you need to do a gap and barriers analysis of your internal framework. You will probably discover that you have more things in place than you expected when you start. What we find is that a lot of countries already have a robust framework on emissions and how to deal with pollution activities, and all of these instruments could be reused or repurposed for CCS or CCUS. So maybe the gaps and barriers aren't that big as expected. And you might already have instruments in place to regulate different types of infrastructure like pipelines and ship transportation, rails, and so forth. So spending a good chunk of time actually doing this properly will save you a lot of time down the road from redrafting things that you already have. And then clearly define what you actually need to spend time on drafting. The World Bank, we've included a case study from the World Bank in this chapter, where they've done a mapping of developing countries, I think mostly in African and Balkan countries, regions, where they identify that most of these countries had a lot of these instruments they needed in place already. Several countries had a characterization of what CO2 is in terms of, is it a waste, is it a commodity, et cetera, et cetera. You have environmental impact assessment frameworks and other frameworks that you can take into use for CCUS as well. We've included a couple of examples in this slide that are not from the World Bank report, but it's still important to highlight that actual CCUS projects have been both deployed in terms of both a commercial project or 2 commercial projects in Norway and a demonstration project in Japan, in jurisdictions where that at the point in time of a deployment of these projects, there were actually no CCUS specific frameworks in place, meaning that the countries took into use the existing frameworks, put together what they needed to make these projects happen. There will be more details also on these 2 projects or these 2 case studies in the drafting chapter that we will get back to later as well. Worth looking up and study in detail. So next step is also then starting to pull on resources outside of your own framework. So now you've gone through the policy and strategy defining process, you mapped your own internal frameworks, and you identify the gaps and barriers. Now you need to, or we recommend that you take a look at what's happening outside of your country borders. There are a number of early mover legal frameworks in place already that you can use as inspiration for your framework development. There are best practices and other instruments that we will get back to later as well, like ISO standards. There's actually a separate chapter on these resources, or on several of these resources available. So you can look up more descriptions of what type of frameworks these are and how they can be used in order to make your drafting process much easier and more to the point and fit for purpose for CCS. So these spending some time on this step will save you probably a lot of time going into the drafting process. As here you can not just see what type of frameworks are already in place in other countries, but there are also several of these countries having published reports on project developments with different levels of success, which basically are part of testing those early mover frameworks and identifying what worked well and what didn't work so well, so that you can learn from those early movers and start at a higher level when you are drafting your framework. So now we're kind of getting into the weeds of making that, taking the information that you have on your gaps and barriers and the information you have from how other countries have solved these issues before. And you are kind of merging them together to identify how are you going to make this a fit for purpose framework for your country. And basically, there are two main roads you can take to implement the framework. Either is a standalone CCUS framework, which is what we see in, for example, the US onshore framework for geological storage of CO2, or you can amend an existing framework. So, for example, countries with a lot of oil and gas activities already might have a well-developed framework for permitting, for characterization of geological resources, etc. And a lot of these instruments can either be repurposed or amended to a certain degree in order to fit CCS activities into that. And of course, there is, as I mentioned earlier, if there is no framework in place already, you can pull on those international resources that you mapped in step 3 and utilize those as resources into your framework as well. Getting closer to the end of the process of implementing framework work, I could say it's actually not the end, because you would probably have to revisit this in the future. Because even though you identify how you, what type of model you are, which is most appropriate for your country, being regulate something from scratch or amending something existing, you might actually need to test that framework on real life projects in order to see if it actually was fit for purpose for your country. And as you get a few of those projects through that framework, you can go back and reopen the framework and close some of the gaps or barriers that you will potentially identify in that process. So this is this is basically where you put all the nitty-gritty details. Are you putting it into law format? Are you doing regulations, decrees, and so forth? All of these inputs from the previous steps will be put into place here in step 5. Step 6, the final one, when you're implementing this framework, here you have, and some of these things will already be in place probably when you are drafting. You would already have the agency in place, most likely, because the agency in place with the authority to actually permit the activities and do compliance under this framework would potentially also most likely be involved in writing the framework itself. And this stems back also to the strategy and policy process that we looked at for step 1. So that's kind of highlighting or emphasizing what I said earlier about these 6 steps overlapping a little bit, and then you have to go back and forth a little bit maybe. So, and here we also have that step of pilot testing the framework, which would potentially, as I mentioned, make you go back to step 5 and do some redrafting. So this is a very dynamic process. So even though you go through the motions, you go through the 6 steps, there would always be room for improvement. And I think the main takeaway from this 6-step process is that it only has to be good enough to start the first few projects moving, and that you can always go back and improve to make it even better at a later point in time. And there will be in this implementation process as well the need not just to test the framework on projects, but this is also where the regulators and the industry get comfortable with the framework. They're going through the hoops of actually doing the permitting process, and there is also a lot of training. And this training that we are pointing out to in the implementation step of the process is actually something that you would have to do already from step 1 and following through the process to step 6, because the regulators need to have a certain level of knowledge related to the technologies that you would need to use in order to implement CCUS. Also climate mitigation policies and kind of the whole geological perspective of storage. All of these things would be something that we also see that regulators around the world are spending a lot of time on, doing internal capacity building with their agencies in order to make sure that not only are they developing a regulatory framework that is fit for purpose, but they are also well equipped to do the compliance, to do the management, and to do the administration of these activities under the framework that they are drafting. So this is a very integrated and dynamic process. I think that is maybe the most important that we can highlight from the implementation step. So with that, I'm through with the steps, but I would recommend you to go into the other chapters as well, as Priya mentioned earlier, to look up some of the resources that you can use in this process, but also more concrete tips on the actual drafting process itself. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ingvild, and yeah, stay tuned for the next chapter, chapter 6, which we will dive into the resources that Ingvild mentioned. And thanks again to our funder, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources, for funding and supporting all of this work.